in the quiet hours before sleep, when the mind begins to slow and the world grows soft around the edges, there is comfort in stories. Stories of real lives, lived with patience and grace. Stories that unfold gently, like waves rolling onto shore, one after another, steady and unhurried. Tonight, let us travel back through time to meet a man whose story changed what we know about memory, about consciousness, about the human brain itself. His name was Henry Gustav Malleson, though for most of his life, the world knew him only as H.M., two letters that would become among the most famous initials in all of neuroscience. This is a true story. Every detail, every moment, every discovery that follows actually happened. It is a story of science and mystery, of loss and contribution, of a man who lived 55 years trapped in a single eternal moment. It is a story that asks profound questions about what makes us who we are, about how memory shapes our experience of being alive, about what remains when the ability to remember is taken away. Let your breathing slow as we begin. Let your mind settle into the rhythm of the telling. There is no rush, no urgency. Like Henry himself, we will move through this story moment by moment, allowing each detail to unfold in its own time. In its own way, this is the story of the man who could not remember tomorrow, could not recall yesterday, but who gave the world an extraordinary gift of understanding. Let us begin at the beginning, in a quieter time, in a small corner of New England where nothing seemed extraordinary at all. Part 1. Before the Silence. The year was 1926, and America was in the midst of the Roaring Twenties. Jazz music filled the speakeasies, despite prohibition. Silent films flickered in darkened theaters. The Model T Ford had made automobile ownership possible for ordinary families, and the roads of Connecticut were no longer just dirt paths, but increasingly paved highways connecting town to town. It was into this world. On February 26, 1926, that Henry Gustav Malleson was born in Manchester, Connecticut. The hospital was small, the birth unremarkable. His parents, Elizabeth and Gustav Malleson, were working-class people of modest means, but strong values. His father was quiet and hard-working, a man of few words who provided for his family with steady, patient labor. His mother was devoted and protective, the kind of woman who kept a clean house and made sure her son's clothes were always mended and pressed. Baby Henry was healthy, with a round face and curious eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. He cried no more and no less than other babies. He learned to walk at the usual age, taking his first wobbly steps across the living room floor while his mother watched nervously, ready to catch him if he fell. He learned to talk, first in simple words, Mama, Dada, more and then in longer sentences that revealed a gentle, thoughtful nature. The Malleson home was not wealthy, but it was filled with the kind of warmth that doesn't depend on money. There were home-cooked meals at a table where the family sat together. There were bedtime stories read by lamplight. There were summer evenings spent on the front porch, watching neighbors pass by, greeting them with waves and brief conversations about the weather, the crops, the small happenings that constituted neighborhood news in those days. Young Henry was a quiet child, not shy exactly, but reserved. He preferred reading to roughhousing, preferred the company of one or two close friends to large groups. He attended the local elementary school, where he proved to be a capable student. His handwriting was neat, his arithmetic solid, his reading comprehension good. His teachers noted that he was polite, respectful, and conscientious about completing his homework. He had a particular fascination with how things worked. He would take apart broken clocks and try to put them back together, spreading the tiny gears and springs across the kitchen table while his mother watched with a mixture of pride and concern. He built model airplanes from balsa wood and tissue paper, carefully following the instructions, patient when pieces didn't fit correctly on the first try. He liked puzzles, the kind where you had to think several steps ahead to see the solution. The neighborhood where Henry grew up was typical of American towns in that era. Houses stood close together, separated by narrow yards where mothers hung laundry on clotheslines and fathers tended small vegetable gardens. Children played kick-the-can in the streets, their shouts echoing off the houses as the summer sun set slowly, reluctant to give way to night. In winter, those same streets became sledding runs, and Henry would join the other children, flying down the snowy hills on wooden sleds, his cheeks red with cold, his breath visible in the frozen air. There were church services on Sundays, the family dressed in their best clothes, sitting in worn wooden pews while the minister spoke about grace and redemption and the importance of living a righteous life. There were holidays: Christmas, with its modest gifts and special meals, Easter with its eggs hidden in the garden, the 4th of July with its fireworks and picnics. Young Henry's childhood was woven from these ordinary moments, the kind of moments that most of us accumulate and forget, never realizing how precious they are until something changes. And for Henry, everything was about to change. It was the summer of 1933. Henry was 7 years old. That perfect age when childhood still feels eternal. When summer vacation stretches ahead like an endless expanse of freedom and possibility. School had let out, and the days were long and warm. Henry spent his time playing with neighborhood friends, reading adventure books checked out from the local library, helping his mother in the garden where tomatoes ripened on their vines and green beans climbed wooden stakes. On this particular afternoon, the date lost to history, but the event forever burned into the trajectory of Henry's life. He was riding his bicycle. It was nothing fancy, just a simple bike with fat tires and a bell on the handlebar that rang when you squeezed it. Henry loved that bicycle. It represented independence, the ability to travel beyond his own street, to explore the wider neighborhood, to feel the wind in his hair as he pedaled fast down hills. He was riding along a familiar street, perhaps thinking about nothing in particular the way children do, or perhaps focused intently on some imaginary game, some story he was telling himself about knights or pirates or cowboys. We don't know the exact circumstances. What we do know is that something happened, rock in the road, a moment of inattention, a dog darting out unexpectedly, and Henry fell. The bicycle clattered to the pavement. Henry's body followed, his head striking the hard ground with force. For a moment, the world probably went dark. Then consciousness returned, swimming up from the depths like a person breaking the surface of water, gasping for air. Henry lay on the pavement, dazed and frightened, pain radiating from his head. Neighbors rushed to help. Someone ran to fetch his mother. He was helped up, walked home, his mother's face pale with worry as she examined the growing bump on his head. There was no bleeding, which seemed like a good sign. In 1933, medical care was not what it would become decades later. There were no CT scans, no MRIs, no advanced imaging techniques. A child who fell and hit his head was watched for signs of serious injury in consciousness, vomiting, confusion, but if those signs didn't appear immediately, it was assumed the child would be fine, and Henry seemed fine. The bump on his head subsided over the following days. He returned to his normal activities. His parents stopped watching him quite so anxiously. Life went back to its usual rhythms, but deep inside Henry's brain, something had been damaged. The fall had caused a subtle injury to his temporal lobes, a bruising or a small hemorrhage that would never be detected because the technology to detect it didn't exist yet. The damage lay dormant, like a seed planted in dark soil, waiting for conditions that would allow it to grow into something devastating. 2 years passed. Henry turned 9 years old. He had continued through school, making the transition from 3rd grade to 4th. He had grown taller, his face losing some of its childish roundness. He had new friends and new interests. The bicycle accident was largely forgotten. Just one of those childhood mishaps that happens to almost everyone. The kind of story that gets told at family gatherings. Remember that time Henry fell off his bike and gave us all such a scare? It was an afternoon like any other when Henry was walking home from school. His books were strapped together with a leather belt, slung over his shoulder the way students carried their books in those days before backpacks became common. He was perhaps thinking about homework, or about playing outside before dinner, or about nothing at all. And then, without any warning, without any chance to prepare or protect himself, the first seizure struck. His body went rigid, all his muscles contracting simultaneously in a terrible, involuntary spasm. He fell to the sidewalk like a puppet whose strings had been suddenly cut. His books scattered. His arms and legs began to convulse, jerking violently in rhythms he could not control. His eyes rolled back. Foam appeared at his lips. His consciousness was simply gone, swept away by the electrical storm raging through his brain. Neighbors who witnessed the event were terrified. In 1935, public understanding of epilepsy was poor, clouded by centuries of superstition and fear. Some people believed seizures were evidence of demonic possession. Others thought epilepsy was contagious, or a sign of moral weakness, or punishment for sins. Even well-meaning people were often unsure what to do when someone had a seizure. But one neighbor, perhaps a woman hanging laundry who saw Henry fall, or a man working in his garden who heard the commotion, had the presence of mind to send someone running for Henry's parents while staying with the convulsing boy to make sure he didn't hurt himself further. The seizure lasted perhaps a minute, perhaps 2. Time has a strange quality during a seizure, stretching and compressing in ways that make accurate estimation nearly impossible. When Henry's consciousness finally returned, he was lying on the sidewalk, surrounded by concerned faces. He was confused, disoriented, exhausted. His muscles ached from the violent contractions. His head throbbed. He had no memory of what had happened, no awareness that he had just experienced a grand mal seizure, the first of thousands that would plague him for the next 2 decades. His parents took him to a doctor, traveling to Hartford where specialists practiced. The doctor examined Henry, asked questions about the fall 2 years earlier, and delivered the diagnosis that would define the next phase of Henry's life: epilepsy. The word itself had an ominous weight, carrying with it all the stigma and fear that surrounded the condition in that era. The doctor prescribed phenobarbital, a sedative medication that had shown some promise in controlling seizures. It was relatively new as an epilepsy treatment. Having been introduced in the early 1900s, the medication made Henry drowsy and affected his ability to concentrate. But it was all that medical science had to offer in 1935. His parents filled the prescription. began the daily routine of making sure Henry took his medicine, and hoped desperately that it would work. But epilepsy is a cunning opponent, and the seizures came again. At first, they were separated by weeks or even months, long enough that Henry and his family could almost believe the problem had been solved. But gradually, inexorably, the seizures became more frequent. They struck in the classroom, causing teachers to rush to Henry's side while other students watched in frightened silence. They struck at the dinner table, causing his fork to clatter to his plate as his body stiffened. They struck at night, waking the entire household with the sounds of Henry's convulsions. Each seizure followed a similar pattern. There would be a brief aura, a strange feeling that some people with epilepsy can recognize as a warning, though Henry may not have always noticed it. Then consciousness would vanish, taken away in an instant. His body would undergo the tonic phase, going rigid, his back arching, his jaw clenching tight. This would be followed by the clonic phase, the violent jerking movements that gave seizures their frightening appearance. And finally, there would be the postictal period, the aftermath, when Henry would slowly return to consciousness, confused and exhausted, sometimes not knowing where he was or what had happened. The teenage years, which should have been a time of growing independence and social development, became instead a time of increasing limitation for Henry. His parents were afraid to let him go places alone, worried that he might have a seizure in an unsafe location. His schoolwork suffered, not because he lacked intelligence, but because the combination of frequent seizures and heavy medication made it difficult to concentrate and retain information. His social life contracted as other teenagers, unsure how to respond to his condition, gradually drifted away. Henry himself bore this burden with remarkable grace. He didn't complain, didn't rage against the unfairness of his situation. He took his medications faithfully. He avoided situations that seemed to trigger seizures, bright flashing lights, sleep deprivation, extreme stress. He adapted his life around his condition, narrowing his world to make it safer, even as that narrowing meant giving up the normal experiences of adolescence. His parents watched helplessly as their son's life grew smaller and smaller. They took him to different doctors, tried different medications, followed every piece of advice they received. But the seizures continued, resistant to treatment, growing more frequent and more severe as Henry moved through his teenage years and into young adulthood. By the time Henry graduated from high school in 1945, World War II was ending. Young men his age were returning from Europe and the Pacific, ready to build lives and start families. But Henry's epilepsy made normal adult life seem impossible. He took a job as a motor winder, a position that required steady hands and careful attention to detail. He was good at the work when he was able to do it, his childhood interest in how things worked serving him well. But employers grew increasingly concerned about the liability of having an employee who might suddenly lose consciousness and fall to the factory floor. The medications were increased, their dosages pushed higher in an attempt to control the seizures. Phenobarbital was supplemented with other drugs, Dilantin, various bromides, experimental compounds. Henry moved through his days in a fog of pharmaceutical sedation. His thinking slowed, his reflexes dulled, his personality flattened by the chemical assault on his brain. And still the seizures came, breaking through the medication like waves, crashing through at inadequate seed weld. By his mid, Henry was experiencing major seizures, grand mal attacks, involving full loss of consciousness and violent convulsions, approximately once a week. But these major events were just the most visible manifestation of his epilepsy. Between the grand mal seizures, he suffered from minor seizures, petty mal attacks that caused brief lapses in consciousness, moments where Henry would simply stop mid-sentence, his eyes staring blankly, before consciousness returned and he continued as if nothing had happened, often unaware that time had passed. The constant seizures were destroying Henry's quality of life. He couldn't drive, couldn't maintain steady employment, couldn't make plans with any confidence that he would be conscious to keep them. The medications that were supposed to help made him perpetually drowsy and interfered with his ability to think clearly. He lived with his parents, dependent on them for care and support, watching as other men his age married, started careers, built independent lives. It was a desperate situation, and desperate situations sometimes call for desperate measures. In 1953, Henry and his family learned about a neurosurgeon named William Beecher Scoville who was experimenting with a radical new approach to treating severe epilepsy. Part 2. The Surgery That Changed. Everything. Dr. William Beecher Scoville was a man of his time, ambitious and bold, willing to push the boundaries of what neurosurgery could accomplish. In the early 1950s, he was working at Hartford Hospital, not far from where Henry lived, and he had developed a theory about treating epilepsy that was as innovative as it was dangerous. Scoville believed that by removing the portions of the brain where seizures originated, he could cure epilepsy. The medial temporal lobes, deep structures within the brain that included the hippocampus, the amygdala, and surrounding cortical tissue, were known to be involved in many cases of temporal lobe epilepsy. Scoville reasoned that if these structures were removed, the seizures would stop. He had performed similar operations on patients with severe psychiatric conditions, removing portions of the medial temporal lobes in an attempt to alleviate symptoms of psychosis and schizophrenia. This was an era when psychosurgery was seen as a legitimate, if controversial, treatment option. The lobotomy, which would later be recognized as barbaric and ineffective, was still being performed and was even considered worthy of a Nobel Prize. In this context, Scoville's approach to epilepsy surgery seemed reasonable, even hopeful. When Henry and his family learned about Scoville's work, they saw it as perhaps their last chance. Henry was 27 years old, and his life had been reduced to a narrow existence circumscribed by seizures and medication. He couldn't work, couldn't live independently, couldn't do any of the things that constitute normal adult life. The surgery was risky, certainly, but the alternative was to continue as they had been, watching Henry's life slip away one seizure at a time. The decision to undergo the surgery was not made lightly. There were consultations with Dr. Scoville, discussions about risks and potential benefits. Scoville was honest about the experimental nature of the procedure. He had performed bilateral medial temporal lobe resections on psychiatric patients, and some had shown improvement in their symptoms. But he had never performed the procedure specifically for epilepsy. Henry would be, in effect, an experiment. But what choice did Henry have? The conventional treatments had failed utterly. The seizures were destroying his life. At least surgery offered hope, however uncertain, and so the date was set. September 1st, 1953. The morning of the surgery dawned like any other late summer day in Connecticut. The sky was perhaps blue, or perhaps overcast. The temperature was probably mild, comfortable, the kind of weather that makes people grateful for the changing seasons. Henry arrived at Hartford Hospital with his parents. He was admitted, prepared for surgery, his head shaved where the incisions would be made. Dr. Scoville and his surgical team spent time reviewing the procedure, making final preparations. The operation would require extreme precision. They would need to open Henry's skull on both sides, carefully retract the brain tissue, and access the deep medial temporal lobe structures. They would then remove the hippocampus, a seahorse-shaped structure that curved beneath the temporal lobes, along with the surrounding amygdala and cortical tissue. The surgery itself was long and painstaking. Henry was under general anesthesia, unconscious and unaware as Scoville worked inside his brain. The surgeon made careful incisions, used delicate instruments to remove tissue, worked with a kind of focused concentration that only comes after years of training and practice. The hippocampus on the left side of the brain was removed. Then the hippocampus on the right side, the amygdala, the entorhinal cortex, the perineal cortex. All of these structures were partially or completely excised. When the surgery was finally complete, Henry's skull was closed, his scalp sutured. He was moved to recovery, where he slowly emerged from anesthesia. The surgery had been technically successful. There had been no major complications, no excessive bleeding, no obvious errors. Dr. Scoville believed he had given Henry the best possible chance at a life free from seizures. And in this primary goal, the surgery succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. When Henry recovered from the immediate post-operative period, when the swelling in his brain subsided and he was able to resume normal activities, it became clear that the seizures had been dramatically reduced. The grand mal attacks that had plagued him for 20 years were now rare. The minor seizures had decreased in frequency. The electrical storms that had raged through Henry's brain since childhood had been quieted. Henry could now live without the constant fear of losing consciousness at any moment. He could think more clearly because the medication dosages could be reduced. He could make plans without wondering if a seizure would strike and prevent him from keeping them. In this sense, the surgery had worked exactly as intended, but something else had happened, something that Dr. Scoville and his team had not anticipated, something that would prove far more significant than the reduction in seizures. Henry could no longer form new memories. The discovery of this profound deficit was gradual. In the immediate aftermath of the surgery, it was difficult to assess Henry's cognitive functions with precision. He was recovering from major brain surgery, taking pain medications, dealing with the physical trauma of having his skull opened and portions of his brain removed. He was confused and disoriented. But this seemed natural given the circumstances. But as days turned into weeks, a disturbing pattern emerged. The nurses who cared for Henry noticed that he never seemed to recognize them, even though they saw him every day. Each morning, when a nurse entered his room, Henry would greet her politely, as if meeting her for the first time. The nurse might explain that she had been his nurse for the past week, that they had conversations yesterday and the day before, but Henry would have no memory of this. To him, every encounter was new. He couldn't remember what he had eaten for breakfast, couldn't recall conversations he had had an hour earlier, couldn't learn his way from his hospital room to the bathroom even after making the trip dozens of times. He would read the same magazine article multiple times, always finding it fresh and engaging. Never recognizing that he had read it before, Dr. Scoville began to test Henry's memory more formally, and the results were shocking. Henry's memory for events before the surgery seemed relatively intact. He could remember his childhood, his parents, his school years. He could recall events from his life before 1953 with reasonable accuracy. though some of the memories were vague or incomplete. But everything after the surgery was simply gone. Henry had no memory of the surgery itself, no memory of the days and weeks of recovery, no memory of the tests Dr. Scoville was conducting. More troubling still, he could not form any new memories at all. Information presented to Henry would remain in his awareness for perhaps 30 seconds, maybe a minute if he focused intensely on it, but then it would vanish completely, as if it had never existed. This was not merely poor memory or the kind of forgetting that everyone experiences. This was something far more profound. Henry's ability to transfer information from short-term, working memory into long-term storage had been completely destroyed. The surgery that had cured his epilepsy had simultaneously severed his connection to the future, leaving him trapped in an eternal present from which there was no escape. Dr. Scoville was stunned. He had known the medial temporal lobes were important for brain function. Why else perform surgery there? But he had not understood that the hippocampus was essential for memory formation. No one had understood this. It was new knowledge, purchased at the terrible cost of Henry's ability to remember. Scoville immediately published a paper describing Henry's case, warning other neurosurgeons about the catastrophic consequences of bilateral medial temporal lobe removal. The paper, titled Loss of Recent Memory After Bilateral Hippocampal Lesions, appeared in the Journal of Neurology, Neurosurgery, and Psychiatry in 1957. In it, Scoville described Henry's profound amnesia and urged caution in performing similar surgeries. The message was clear. The hippocampus is not optional. Remove it on both sides, and you destroy the person's ability to create new memories. But for Henry, this publication changed nothing. The damage was done, permanent and irreversible. He would have to find a way to live in a world where every moment was isolated, disconnected from every other moment, where the past ended in 1953 and the future could never begin. It was at this point that a young researcher named Brenda Milner entered Henry's life, beginning a scientific relationship that would last for decades and transform our understanding of human memory. Part 3. The Eternal Present Dr. Brenda Milner was a cognitive psychologist working at the Montreal Neurological Institute under the mentorship of the famous neurosurgeon Wilder Penfield. When she learned about Henry's unusual condition from Dr. Scoville's publication, she immediately recognized that he represented an extraordinary opportunity to study the mechanisms of human memory. At the time, in the mid-1950s, memory was poorly understood. Psychologists and neuroscientists had theories, of course, but there was little concrete evidence about how memories were formed, where they were stored, or what brain structures were necessary for different types of memory. Henry's specific, limited brain damage created what scientists call a natural experiment, a chance to see what happens when one particular brain structure is removed while everything else remains intact. Dr. Milner arranged to visit Henry, traveling from Montreal to Connecticut. When she first met him in 1955, 2 years after his surgery, she encountered a polite, gentle young man of 29 who seemed, on the surface, relatively normal. He could carry on a conversation, could answer questions, could joke and laugh. His intelligence seemed intact, his personality pleasant and cooperative. But as their conversation continued, the profound nature of Henry's deficit became apparent. Dr. Milner introduced herself, explaining who she was and why she was visiting. Henry listened politely. Then, a few minutes later, if Dr. Milner left the room and returned, Henry would greet her as if they had never met. She would reintroduce herself. He would listen politely. The cycle would repeat endlessly. Henry never showing any sign of recognizing this woman he had now met dozens of times. Dr. Milner began her systematic study of Henry's memory, work that would continue for the rest of Henry's life and would establish her as one of the pioneering researchers in cognitive neuroscience. She designed clever experiments that could tease apart different aspects of memory, revealing the hidden architecture of how the brain stores and retrieves information. One of her most famous experiments involved a task called mirror drawing. The setup was simple. Henry was asked to trace the outline of a star shape with a pencil. But with one crucial twist, he could only see his hand and the star through a mirror, which reversed the visual information. Anyone who has tried this knows how difficult it is at first. Your brain receives visual information that contradicts what your hand is doing, and the result is a wobbly, inaccurate line that wanders outside the star's boundaries. The first time Henry attempted this task, he performed poorly, exactly as expected. His hand moved uncertainly, his pencil strayed outside the lines, his traced star was messy and imprecise. But Dr. Milner had him repeat the task, not just once, but multiple times over several days. And something remarkable happened. Each time Henry sat down to do the mirror drawing task, he had absolutely no memory of having done it before. He would tell Dr. Milner that he had never seen this task, that it was completely new to him. He would express surprise at the difficulty of drawing while looking in a mirror, as if the concept itself was novel. Yet despite his complete lack of conscious memory, his performance improved. His hand grew steadier with each trial. His traced stars became cleaner, more accurate. He was learning the skill, even though he had no conscious awareness of ever having practiced it. This was a revelation of profound importance. It demonstrated that memory was not a single, unified thing, but rather a collection of different systems that could operate independently. Henry had lost the ability to form new, declarative memories, conscious, explicit memories of facts and events that you can describe in words. But he retained the ability to form procedural memories, implicit memories of skills and habits that you demonstrate through performance rather than conscious recollection. Dr. Milner published her findings, and the neuroscience community was electrified. Here was concrete evidence that the brain had multiple memory systems, that the hippocampus was essential for some types of memory but not others. This single insight opened up entire new avenues of research and transformed how scientists thought about memory. But while Dr. Milner's research was advancing human knowledge, Henry himself had to figure out how to actually live with his condition. And so, after his recovery from surgery and the initial period of testing, Henry returned home to live with his parents in their house in Connecticut. His mother, Elizabeth, took on the primary responsibility for his care. She adapted to the strange reality of having a son who could not remember her from one moment to the next. Each morning, when Henry woke up, he had no memory of the previous day. His mother would greet him, and he would respond politely, but without any sense of continuity from yesterday's greeting to today's. She developed routines that could help structure Henry's days. Breakfast at the same time each morning, lunch at noon, dinner at 6 in the evening. The repetition couldn't create memories for Henry, but it could create a kind of rhythm, a predictability that might have provided some unconscious comfort even. If he couldn't consciously recognize it, Henry's days took on a circular, repetitive quality. He would wake up, dress himself, come downstairs for breakfast. His mother would have prepared the same meal she prepared most mornings, cereal perhaps, or eggs and toast. Henry would eat, and then perhaps he would sit in the living room with the newspaper. He would read articles with interest, turning the pages, absorbing information that would vanish from his awareness moments after he moved on to the next article. His mother might tell him about plans for the day. Perhaps they would go to the grocery store, or she had errands to run. Henry would nod, would seem to understand and agree. But moments later, if she mentioned the plans again, they would be new information, heard for the first time. She learned to repeat things frequently, to remind Henry constantly of what was happening now. What would happen next? Imagine living like this, in a world where nothing new can be integrated into your understanding of yourself and your life. Every experience is isolated, disconnected from what came before and what will come after. You can't learn from your mistakes because you can't remember making them. You can't look forward to planned events because you can't hold them in your memory long enough to anticipate them. You can't deepen relationships over time because each interaction stands alone, unconnected to previous interactions. Yet Henry endured this with remarkable patience and good humor. The researchers who studied him, the nurses who cared for him, the family members who lived with him, all remarked on his gentle nature, his courtesy, his lack of anger or bitterness. Perhaps this was simply Henry's personality, a fundamental kindness that survived the surgery intact. Or perhaps it was a function of his amnesia itself. How can you be bitter about your condition if you can't remember it long enough to develop bitterness? Dr. Milner continued to visit Henry regularly, conducting new experiments, testing different aspects of his cognitive abilities. She brought other researchers to meet him, helping to establish a community of scientists who were interested in what Henry's unique condition could teach them about the brain. Henry participated willingly in all of this research, though he never understood the larger context. Each testing session was new to him. Each researcher a stranger. The experiments grew more sophisticated as understanding of memory deepened. Researchers tested Henry's working memory, his ability to hold information in mind for brief periods. Sand found it largely intact. He could remember a string of numbers for about 30 seconds if he focused on them, repeating them to himself to keep them active in his mind. But the moment his attention shifted, the numbers were gone forever. They tested his semantic memory, his knowledge of facts and concepts, and found that information he had learned before the surgery was mostly preserved. He knew that George Washington was the first president. He knew that 2 + 2 = 4. He knew the meanings of words, the names of colors, the basic facts about the world that everyone carries with them. But he could not add new semantic knowledge. If you told Henry a new fact that Alaska had become a state in 1959, he might be able to repeat it back to you immediately. But moments later, when you asked him about Alaska, he would have no memory of what you had just told him. They tested his emotional responses and found something intriguing. If someone was consistently kind to Henry over multiple sessions, he seemed to develop a positive feeling toward that person, even though he couldn't consciously remember ever meeting them. Conversely, if someone was rude or unpleasant to Henry repeatedly, he seemed to show a subtle wariness around them, even without conscious memory of their previous interactions. This suggested that emotional memory might follow different neural pathways than declarative memory, that the brain might have multiple ways of storing information about the world. The years passed slowly. Henry's father died in the early 1960s, succumbing to illness. Henry attended the funeral, but afterward he had no memory of it. His mother would have to tell him again and again that his father had passed away. and each time Henry would experience the grief as if learning the news for the first time. The loss could never become familiar, could never be integrated into a narrative of his life. It remained perpetually fresh, perpetually painful, like a wound that could never heal because it was being reopened moment by moment. By the 1970s, Henry was in his 40s. His mother was aging, her hair turning grey, her movements becoming slower and more careful. The task of caring for Henry, of managing his daily needs, of protecting him from a world he couldn't navigate alone, was becoming more difficult for her. She was devoted to her son, but the burden was heavy, and she was not getting any younger. Henry himself showed no physical signs of his amnesia. He looked like any other middle-aged man. His hair was thinning a bit, perhaps going grey at the temples. He might have put on a little weight or lost a little weight, as people do over the years. But cognitively, he remained frozen at age 27, the age at which his ability to form new memories had been destroyed. The world had changed dramatically around him. The 1960s had brought cultural revolution, political upheaval, technological advancement, but none of it registered in Henry's awareness in any lasting way. He had no sense of the passage of time, because time, for most of us, is marked by accumulated memories. We know it's been years since an event because we can remember all the things that have happened between then and now. But Henry had no such markers. Each day was disconnected from the day before, and so there was no subjective experience of time passing. He might have believed he was still in his 20s, or he might not have had any clear sense of his own age at all. The research continued, generating paper after paper, each one adding a new piece to the puzzle of how memory works. Henry became famous in the neuroscience community, though always as HM's full name kept confidential to protect his privacy. Students in psychology and neuroscience programs around the world studied his case in their textbooks. Researchers cited his case in their papers. Conferences featured presentations about what HM had taught us about the brain, but Henry himself knew nothing of this fame. He could not understand his contribution to science because understanding requires memory, requires being able to connect past experiences to present circumstances, to see how one's actions have had consequences over time. For Henry, there were no consequences, no continuity, no narrative arc. There was only the present moment, repeating endlessly like a song stuck on a single note. Part 4, A Life in Moments, the 1970s, brought significant changes to Henry's life, though he could not consciously understand or remember these changes. His mother, Elizabeth, who had cared for him devotedly since his surgery in 1953, was growing older and frailer. The daily tasks of caring for Henry, preparing his meals, managing his medications, supervising his activities to ensure his safety were becoming increasingly difficult for her. In 1977, arrangements were made for Henry to move to a care facility. The Bickford Healthcare Center in Windsor Locks, Connecticut, would become Henry's home for the remainder of his life. This was a necessary transition, but it must have been profoundly disorienting for Henry, if such a concept even applied to someone living in his condition. Imagine waking up every morning in an unfamiliar room. The bed is not your bed. The walls are painted in institutional color you don't recognize. There are strangers in the hallway outside your door, voices you've never heard before. Someone enters your room, a nurse, perhaps, and greets you by name, but you have no idea who this person is. They tell you this is where you live now, that you've been here for weeks or months or years, but you have no memory of this place, no memory of yesterday or the day before. This was Henry's daily experience at the nursing home. Every morning was the first morning. Every face was a new face. Every meal was a surprise. The staff learned to be patient with him, to explain repeatedly who they were and where he was, knowing that their explanations would be forgotten moments after they left the room. Some of the nursing staff became fond of Henry. He was never difficult or demanding. He was always polite, always courteous, always willing to participate in activities or follow instructions. His gentleness and good nature made him a favorite among many of the caregivers, even though he could never remember their names or faces, even though every interaction with him had to begin from zero. The researchers continued their visits. Dr. Milner, now a distinguished scientist whose work with Henry had helped establish her reputation, still came regularly, though less frequently than in the early years. She brought new generations of graduate students with her, introducing them to Henry, showing them firsthand what amnesia looked like, letting them experience the peculiar reality of talking with someone who could not remember the conversation even as it was happening. A younger researcher, Dr. Suzanne Corkin from MIT, became increasingly involved in studying Henry. She was a neuropsychologist with a deep interest in memory systems, and she saw in Henry an opportunity to explore questions that no other research subject could answer. Over the decades, Dr. Corkin would become Henry's primary researcher, conducting hundreds of experiments, writing dozens of papers, and serving as a fierce protector of Henry's rights and dignity. Dr. Corkin brought new experimental techniques to the study of Henry's memory. She tested his ability to recognize faces, showing him photographs of people and asking if he had seen them before. Henry could recognize faces from his youth, his parents, old friends, celebrities from the 1940s, but he could not learn to recognize new faces, even of people he saw every single day. She tested his spatial memory, his ability to navigate through environments. Henry could remember the layout of the house where he had grown up, could describe the rooms and where furniture had been placed decades earlier, but he could not learn the layout of the nursing home where he currently lived, could not find his way from his room to the dining area even after walking the same route hundreds of times. She tested his ability to recognize objects, his understanding of language, his capacity for abstract reasoning. In all these areas, Henry showed abilities that were largely intact, preserved from the time before his surgery. His IQ was average or slightly above average. He could solve puzzles in the moment, could follow logical arguments, could understand complex sentences. The surgery had not diminished his intelligence or his basic cognitive abilities. It had only severed his connection to time, cutting him off from the ability to accumulate new experiences into the continuous narrative of a life. The 1980s arrived, and then the 1990s, each decade bringing new technology and new research methods. Brain imaging techniques first, CT scans, then MRI machines allowed researchers to see inside Henry's brain with unprecedented clarity. They could visualize exactly which structures had been removed during the surgery, could measure the precise extent of the damage, could correlate the anatomical lesions with Henry's behavioral and cognitive deficits. The scans confirmed what Scoville had described in his surgical notes. The hippocampus was almost entirely gone on both sides. The surrounding medial temporal lobe structures the entorhinal cortex. The parietal cortex, the perihippocampal gyrus showed significant damage. These were the structures that, in a healthy brain, work together to encode new experiences and consolidate them into long-term memory. Without them, Henry was neurologically incapable of creating lasting records of his daily life. But the rest of Henry's brain appeared relatively normal. His frontal lobes, which support executive functions like planning and decision-making, were intact. His parietal lobes, involved in spatial processing and attention, showed no damage. His occipital lobes, which process visual information, were healthy. This meant that Henry's amnesia was purely a disorder of memory, not a general cognitive impairment. He could see, hear, think, and reason normally. He simply could not remember. The researchers who worked with Henry often marveled at the paradoxes of his condition. He could hold a conversation, responding appropriately to questions and comments, giving no outward sign of his profound memory deficit. But if you left the room for 5 minutes and returned, you were a stranger to him again. He could read a magazine article with engagement and interest, but if you asked him about it moments later, he would have no memory of having read it. He could eat a meal with apparent enjoyment, but within minutes, he would have no recollection of having eaten. His working memory, the ability to hold information in mind for brief periods, remained functional. If you told Henry a phone number, he could repeat it back to you immediately. He could hold it in his mind for perhaps 30 seconds by continuously rehearsing it, saying the digits over and over to himself. But the moment his attention was diverted, the moment he stopped actively thinking about the number, it was gone forever. There was no transfer from working memory to long-term storage. The information simply evaporated, leaving no trace. This revealed something crucial about how normal memory works. When most of us hear a phone number, we can repeat it immediately using working memory. But if we want to remember it later, our brain automatically begins the process of consolidation, transferring the information from temporary storage in working memory to more permanent storage in long-term memory. This consolidation process requires the hippocampus. Without a functioning hippocampus, Henry could hold information temporarily, but he could never make it permanent. Dr. Corkin and other researchers also discovered that Henry could learn certain things through repetition, even without conscious memory. His performance on the mirror drawing task, discovered decades earlier by Dr. Milner, was just one example. Researchers found other tasks where Henry's performance improved over multiple sessions, even though he always insisted he had never done the task before. For instance, Henry could learn to solve the Tower of Hanoi Puzzle, classic problem-solving task involving moving discs between pegs with improving speed and efficiency over multiple attempts. Despite having no memory of previous trials, he could learn to read mirror-reversed text more quickly after practice, even though he always believed he was seeing such text for the first time. His hands learned skills that his conscious mind could never acknowledge. This distinction between conscious, declarative memory and unconscious, procedural memory became one of the foundational concepts in modern neuroscience. It explained how we can ride a bicycle without consciously thinking about the mechanics of balance and pedaling, how musicians can play instruments without consciously recalling how to position their fingers, how athletes can perform complex movements through muscle memory rather than conscious thought. Henry's case also revealed that memory is not stored in a single location in the brain. His memories from before the surgery were largely intact, suggesting that long-term memories, once consolidated, are stored in the cortex rather than in the hippocampus. The hippocampus, it became clear, is necessary for creating new memories but not for storing or retrieving old ones. It's like a router in a computer network, essential for processing new information and sending it to the right destination, but not the final storage location for the data itself. as Henry aged through his 50s and into his 60s. He remained physically healthy for the most part. He didn't develop Alzheimer's disease or other forms of dementia on top of his existing amnesia. His older memories remained relatively stable. He could still recall childhood experiences, could still recognize photographs of his parents from the 1930s and 1940s, could still remember the house where he grew up and the neighborhood where he played as a child. But the world of 1953 and earlier was all he truly knew. Everything after the surgery existed only in the immediate present, in the fleeting 30 seconds or so that his working memory could hold information before it vanished. The Kennedy assassination, the moon landing, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the rise of personal computers, the advent of the internet, all of these world-changing events happened during Henry's lifetime. But none of them registered in his long-term memory. They might have crossed his awareness as he read a newspaper or watched television, but moments later they were gone, leaving no lasting impression. The nursing home staff developed routines for Henry that provided structure to his days. Even if he couldn't remember the routines themselves, he would wake at roughly the same time each morning. Someone would help him get dressed, would guide him to the dining area for breakfast. He would spend time in common areas, perhaps working on jigsaw puzzles or watching television. He would eat lunch, take a nap in the afternoon, eat dinner, watch more television in the evening, and go to bed. Some staff members reported that Henry seemed to have vague, unconscious preferences for certain activities or certain times of day, even though he couldn't articulate why. Perhaps his brain, damaged as it was, could still form some kind of implicit associations, some unconscious patterns that influenced his behavior without creating conscious memories. This was consistent with what the research had shown. Memory is not a single, unified thing but a collection of different systems. And some of those systems could function in Henry even when the system for conscious, explicit memory was destroyed. Dr. Corkin visited Henry regularly throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s. She brought new experiments, new questions to explore, new technologies to apply. She used functional MRI to watch Henry's brain in action, to see which regions showed activity when he performed various tasks. She collected extensive data on his cognitive abilities, his perception, his language skills, his problem-solving capabilities. But beyond the science, Dr. Corkin genuinely cared about Henry's well-being. She made sure he was comfortable during testing sessions, that he had his favorite snacks, that the research never felt like a burden to him. She celebrated his birthdays, even though he wouldn't remember the celebrations afterward. She advocated for his care, making sure the nursing home staff understood the importance of treating him with respect and dignity. The ethical dimensions of conducting research with Henry were complex and troubling. How do you obtain informed consent from someone who cannot form new memories? Henry could consent to a research session in the moment, could understand what was being asked of him and agree to participate. But he could not remember agreeing, could not withdraw his consent later because he had no memory of having given it. Dr. Corkin and the other researchers worked hard to ensure that Henry's participation was always voluntary, that he never seemed distressed or uncomfortable, that the research served a greater good while respecting his humanity. As the millennium turned and the 2000s began, Henry was in his 70s. His hair was white, his face lined with age. He moved more slowly, his body showing the accumulated wear of decades. But cognitively, his amnesia remained unchanged. He was still trapped in the eternal present, still unable to form new memories. still greeting each day and each person as if the first time. The scientific community's debt to Henry was enormous and still growing. Textbooks devoted chapters to his case. Documentaries were made about his life and his contribution to neuroscience. Researchers from around the world studied the papers written about him, using his case to develop new theories about memory, consciousness, and the organization of the brain. Yet Henry himself remained unaware of his fame, unable to comprehend the legacy he was building. Each time someone explained to him that he was helping scientists understand the human brain, that his case had revolutionized neuroscience, that students around the world studied his condition in their courses, the information was new. He would express pleasure at being useful, would say something polite about being happy to help, and then moments later, the conversation would be forgotten. There was something almost Zen-like about Henry's existence, though it was imposed rather than chosen. Eastern philosophy speaks of living in the present moment, of releasing attachment to past and future, of experiencing each instant as it arises without the filter of memory or anticipation. Henry had no choice but to live this way. He could not ruminate on past failures or regrets because he had no access to past failures or regrets. He could not worry about the future because he could not hold the future in mind long enough to worry about it. There was only now, eternally and unchangingly now. Of course, this was not the enlightened presence that mystics seek. It was a neurological condition caused by brain damage, not a spiritual state achieved through discipline and practice. Henry's present moment awareness was not liberation but imprisonment, not transcendence but limitation. Still, there was something to contemplate in the fact that he endured it with such grace, such patience, such absence of bitterness. The nursing home where Henry lived became, in a sense, his entire world. The rooms, the hallways, the dining area, the common spaces, these were the physical boundaries of his existence. Though he could never learn their layout, could never develop a mental map of where things were. The staff members were his daily companions, though they remained perpetual strangers, introduced anew each morning. The other residents were faces he saw repeatedly without ever recognizing them. From previous encounters, Dr. Corkin described visiting Henry in his later years and being struck by his equanimity. Despite the profound strangeness of his existence, despite the complete absence of continuity in his conscious experience, Henry seemed content, or at least not distressed. He engaged with whatever was happening in the present moment of conversation. A meal, a television program with full attention, since the present moment was all he had. Some researchers wondered whether Henry experienced emotions differently because of his amnesia. Emotions, after all, are deeply connected to memory. We feel happiness when we remember good experiences, sadness when we recall losses, anxiety when we anticipate future threats. But Henry had no recalled experiences, no anticipated futures. Did he feel emotions in the same way other people do? The evidence suggested that yes, Henry did experience emotions, though perhaps not in the same prolonged way that others do. If someone told him sad news, he would feel sadness in that moment. If someone told him a joke, he would laugh with genuine amusement. But these emotional responses were fleeting, disconnected from any emotional narrative. Henry couldn't sustain grief because he couldn't remember what he was grieving for. He couldn't hold on to joy because he couldn't remember the source of his joy. This revealed something important about the relationship between emotion and memory. While emotions can exist in the moment, the emotional experiences that shape our personalities and our moods depend on memory to persist over time. Our emotional lives are built from accumulated experiences, from the way past events continue to color our present feelings. Without that accumulation, emotions become purely momentary, arising and dissipating like ripples on water. As Henry entered his 80s, his health began to decline in the ways common to very elderly people. He developed respiratory problems, needed more assistance with basic activities, spent more time resting. Dr. Corkin continued to visit, though the research sessions became shorter and less frequent. The goal now was simply to keep Henry comfortable, to ensure that his final years were lived with dignity and care. In December 2008, Henry Malazan passed away at the age of 80. He died peacefully at the Bickford Healthcare Center, the nursing home that had been his residence for more than 3 decades. He died as he had lived for the past 55 years, without memory of the recent past, without anticipation of the immediate future, existing in an eternal present moment until that present moment finally came to an end. Part 5. The gift that continues. But Henry's contribution to science did not end with his death. Years before, through the careful consent process managed by Dr. Corkin and the research team, Henry had agreed to donate his brain to science after his death. This final gift would allow researchers to examine in unprecedented detail the neural structures that had been damaged. By the 1953 surgery, when Henry died, his brain was carefully removed and preserved. It was transported to the University of California, San Diego, where a team led by neuroscientist Jacopo Anese had prepared for this moment. They had built a specially designed apparatus that would allow them to freeze Henry's brain and slice it into thousands of extremely thin sections, each one only 70 micrometers thick, thinner than a human hair. The sectioning process was carried out in January 2009, just a month after Henry's death. In a remarkable decision, the team decided to stream the entire procedure live over the internet, allowing scientists and interested observers around the world to watch as Henry's brain was transformed from a 3-dimensional organ into thousands of 2-dimensional slices. It took 53 continuous hours to complete the sectioning, the team working in shifts to ensure precision and consistency. Each thin slice of Henry's brain was photographed at high resolution, creating a complete digital archive. The physical sections were preserved on slides, creating a permanent record that researchers could examine under microscopes. Together, these resources would allow scientists to study Henry's brain at the cellular level, to see exactly which neurons and which connections had been damaged, to understand precisely how the surgery had altered his brain's structure. The analysis of these brain sections has continued for years, revealing details that couldn't be observed during Henry's life. Researchers have been able to trace the exact extent of the lesions, to see how the damage affected different layers of cortical tissue, to identify which specific pathways were disrupted. They found that the hippocampus was indeed almost completely absent, with only small remnants remaining. The entorhinal cortex, which serves as the main gateway between the hippocampus and the rest of the brain, showed severe damage. The amygdala, involved in emotional processing, had significant lesions. But the analysis also revealed some surprises. There was more damage to certain areas than Scoville's surgical notes had indicated, and less damage to others. Some structures that researchers thought might be important for memory showed relatively little damage, while other structures showed unexpected lesions. Each finding has helped refine our understanding of how different brain regions contribute to memory, formation, and storage. In 2016, more than 60 years after the surgery that transformed his life and 8 years after his death, Henry's true identity was finally revealed to the public. For decades, He had been known in the scientific literature only as H.M., his full name protected to preserve his privacy. But Dr. Corkin and the research team decided that the world should know the name of the man who had contributed so profoundly to neuroscience. Henry Gustav Malleson. The revelation of his name allowed people to see Henry as a full human being rather than just a case study. Photographs of him were published, showing a man with a gentle face, kind eyes, and a patient expression. Stories were shared by nurses and caregivers who had known him, painting a picture of someone who, despite his profound disability, maintained his courtesy, his willingness to help, his fundamental goodness. The world learned that H.M. had been Henry, not just a collection of interesting symptoms, but a real person with a real life who had made an enormous sacrifice. Even if he could never fully understand what he had sacrificed, he had lived 55 years in a condition that most of us cannot truly imagine, and he had done so with grace and patience, participating in research that would benefit countless others, advancing human knowledge in ways that few individuals ever have. Henry's legacy in neuroscience is vast and multifaceted. His case definitively established that memory is not a single, unified function, but rather a collection of different systems supported by different brain structures. He proved that the hippocampus is essential for forming new, long-term, declarative memories of facts and events, but not for short-term working memory or for procedural learning of skills and habits. His preservation of older memories demonstrated that long-term memories, once consolidated, are stored outside the hippocampus in various cortical regions. His ability to learn motor skills without conscious awareness showed that implicit and explicit memory operate through different neural pathways. His case revealed the distinction between episodic memory for personal experiences, and semantic memory for facts, and showed that these two types of declarative memory, while related, can be dissociated under certain circumstances. Beyond these specific scientific insights, Henry's case raised profound questions about consciousness, personal identity, and what it means to be human. Philosophers and neuroscientists have debated, if we are the sum of our memories, what happens when the ability to form new memories is lost? Henry continued to exist, to perceive, to think, to feel, but in a fundamentally different way than most people. He could not create a continuous narrative of his life, could not build on past experiences, could not plan meaningfully for the future based on remembered past, yet he remained. In some essential way, Henry, his personality persisted. His courtesy, his gentleness, his willingness to help, these traits were maintained even without the accumulation of new memories. This suggests that personal identity extends beyond memory, that there is something in the moment-to-moment experience of being alive that constitutes selfhood even when the past and future are severed. The ethical dimensions of Henry's case continue to be discussed in bioethics courses and research ethics committees. Was it right to conduct so much research on someone who could not form lasting memories of his consent? Dr. Corkin and others argued that Henry genuinely enjoyed participating in research, that he gave his consent freely in each moment, and that he seemed to understand, at least in broad terms, that he was helping scientists understand the brain. His family supported the research, believing that Henry's tragedy could at least serve a greater purpose, could help prevent similar outcomes for future patients, could advance human knowledge in ways that might ultimately reduce suffering. Modern medical ethics now takes Henry's case as a cautionary tale about the importance of fully understanding brain function before performing irreversible surgical interventions. Scoville's surgery on Henry, while successful in reducing seizures, had catastrophic unintended consequences. Today's neurosurgeons approach temporal lobe surgery with far greater caution, removing tissue from only one hemisphere when possible, using more targeted approaches that preserve hippocampal function, employing detailed brain mapping to identify critical structures before making any cuts. Henry's story has been told in countless textbooks, in documentaries, in popular science books, and in academic papers that number in the thousands. He has become more than a case study. He has become a symbol in neuroscience, a reminder of both the brain's astonishing complexity and its fragility. Students learning about memory cannot avoid encountering HM, and through his story, they learn not just about neural mechanisms, but about the human cost of brain injury, the ethical responsibilities of researchers, and the profound connection between memory and identity. In the nursing home where Henry spent his final decades, the staff members who cared for him remembered him with genuine fondness. They spoke of his unchanging politeness, his inability to be bitter despite his condition, his simple willingness to engage with each moment as it came. He would greet every person with a handshake and a kind word, then forget the interaction moments later. He would express gratitude for help, even though he couldn't remember receiving that help. He would laugh at jokes, enjoy meals, watch television with apparent interest, all without any thread of continuity connecting one experience to the next. There is something both heartbreaking and strangely beautiful about Henry's story. He gave science an unparalleled gift, the opportunity to understand how memory works, how the brain creates the continuous sense of self that most of us take for granted. Yet he could never understand the magnitude of his contribution, could never know that his name would be spoken with gratitude and respect in classrooms and laboratories around the world for generations to come. The researchers who devoted their careers to studying Henry, Dr. Milner, Dr. Corkin, and many others developed a deep respect and affection for him that went far beyond scientific interest. They saw him not as a fascinating anomaly, but as a person worthy of dignity, care, and compassion. They worked tirelessly to ensure that the research served both science and Henry's welfare, that he was never exploited or treated merely as an object of study. Dr. Milner, who began working with Henry in 1955 and continued until her death in 2022 at the age of 95, spoke of him in her later years with warmth and admiration. She described meeting him for the first time, being startled by the profound nature of his amnesia, and then spending decades uncovering the hidden architecture of human memory through careful experimentation with this patient, gentle man who could never remember her from one visit to the next. Dr. Corkin, who studied Henry for nearly 50 years until his death, dedicated much of her professional life to understanding his condition while fiercely protecting his welfare. She wrote a book about Henry titled Permanent Present Tense, published in 2013, 5 years after his death. In it, she described both the scientific discoveries that came from studying Henry and the human dimensions of his existence, his daily routines, his personality, his interactions with others, the unique quality of his lived experience. Henry's brain, now preserved in thousands of microscopic sections at UC San Diego, continues to teach us about memory and the brain. Researchers can examine the precise extent of the lesions, can see exactly which neural circuits were disrupted, can correlate the anatomical damage with the behavioral and cognitive deficits that Henry displayed during his life. Each analysis yields new insights, new understanding of how the healthy brain creates the continuous experience of selfhood that allows us to live in time, to connect past and present and future into a coherent whole in a real sense. Henry's contribution to neuroscience will continue for as long as humans study the brain. His case was the foundation on which much of modern memory research has been built. Every subsequent discovery about the hippocampus, about memory consolidation, about the distinction between different types of memory, traces back in some way to what Henry's unique condition revealed. He is, without exaggeration, one of the most important research participants in the history of neuroscience, and yet, Henry never sought this importance, never understood it, could never hold it in his memory long enough to comprehend it. He simply lived his days, moment by moment, participating patiently in research because the researchers asked him to, and because, in each present moment, he was willing to help. His contribution was profound precisely because it was unconscious, because his damaged brain revealed truths about memory that no amount of deliberate experimentation could have uncovered. As we reflect on Henry's life and legacy, we might consider what his story teaches us about ourselves. We live immersed in memory, constantly referring to the past to make sense of the present and plan for the future. Our sense of self is built from accumulated experiences, from the continuous narrative we tell ourselves about who we are and how we came to be this way. Henry lost all of that, and yet he persisted. He remained fundamentally human in his moment-to-moment existence, reminding us that consciousness extends beyond memory, that awareness and presence have value even when they cannot be accumulated into a lasting record. There is a quiet profundity to Henry's story that makes it suitable for contemplation as we prepare for sleep. His life reminds us that existence can continue even when the normal structures of memory fail, that human dignity persists even in the most unusual circumstances, that kindness and patience can endure even when the mind cannot. Hold on to the reasons for kindness or the practice of patience from one day to the next. Let Henry's gentle presence wash over you as you drift towards sleep. Let the repetitive nature of his days, the eternal present tense in which he lived, slow your thoughts and ease your mind. Imagine his simple routines, the way each day began, fresh and new for him, unburdened by yesterday's worries or tomorrow's anxieties. Imagine his patient participation in research, his willingness to help even without understanding the larger purpose, his courtesy and kindness that required no memory to sustain them. Henry Mapleson, known for decades as H.M., the man who lived in the eternal now, has finally found his place in history. He is remembered by the world he could not remember, his name spoken with gratitude by those who understand what he taught us about the mysterious landscape of the human mind. His sacrifice, unwitting though it was, has helped countless people understand themselves, has advanced human knowledge in ways that continue to ripple outward into new discoveries and new understanding. And so, as we honor Henry's memory, we might also let his story guide us toward rest. Let go of your hold on past and future, as Henry was forced to do. Sink into the present moment, into the here and now, into the immediate experience of breathing, of resting, of allowing consciousness to soften and dissolve into sleep. Like Henry in his final moments, like all of us when we finally let go, there is only now this breath, this heartbeat, this gentle fading of awareness as sleep approaches. Rest now, as Henry rested after his long and extraordinary life, in the eternal present, in the gentle now, in the quiet space where memory fades and consciousness simply exists, moment by moment, breath by breath, thought by thought, drifting slowly into the soft darkness of sleep, into the dreamless peace that awaits us all at the end of each day, at the end of every story, at the end of this remarkable tale of the man who could not remember, but who will never be forgotten.